1961, Ansel Keys and his close colleague Jeremiah Stamler managed to get themselves appointed onto the Nutrition Committee of the American Heart Association, and they are able to turn that view around. So in 1961, although there had been no addition to the evidence in that 1 year, the same evidence, in 1961, the American Heart Association comes out with a statement saying that all men should avoid eating saturated fat and dietary cholesterol in order to avoid heart attacks and strokes. So this is the very first official advice anywhere in the world telling people to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol in order to avoid heart attacks. This is where it's all born. This is like the little acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have today. This is where it started with the American Heart Association in 1961. What this meant, in effect, in terms of foods, is people were told to give up eating meat, full-fat dairy, and eggs, and switch to margarine instead of butter and vegetable oils instead of fats like lard or tallow, which was also used at the time, and just to decrease animal foods in general and switch to plant-based foods as a way of avoiding saturated fat and cholesterol. I need to point out that this made little sense at the time in terms of the trends in fat consumption. So that orange arrow is where President Eisenhower has his heart attack. You can see at that point animal fat is already dropping in the United States. And it's vegetable oils, the rise of polyunsaturated vegetable oils, that perfectly parallels the rise in heart disease rates. So you have to understand, polyunsaturated vegetable oils, this is like soybean, corn oil, safflower, sunflower, they didn't exist until the early 1920s. Well, they didn't exist as a foodstuff until 1911 is the first vegetable oil food product introduced in the form of Crisco. I don't know if you have that here. It's hardened vegetable oil that's supposed to imitate lard. You probably have your own name for it, but we called it Crisco, and that was the first introduction of a vegetable oil foodstuff. And it was supposed to replace lard. Later on in the 1940s, they introduced just regular vegetable oils because they figured out how to keep them stable in bottles. So then you have actually oils in bottles that we would used for salad dressings. So you can see that all those foods started growing in the food supply, and but it's highly improbable that the foods that are decreasing, that animal fats, which are decreasing, are the cause of heart attacks compared to vegetable oils, which seem to be a much more well correlated with the rise in heart attacks. The American Heart Association, when it made this announcement, it was big news. It was the first time that anybody had any diet or lifestyle advice on how to avoid a heart attack, and it was Ansel Keys is on the cover of Time magazine. And this is in 1961, that cover. He easily is the most important nutrition science of the 20th century. In the article that is in this magazine, Keys is depicted as unbridled and sharp, commanding authority. He said people should know the facts, and then if they want to eat themselves to death, let them. Although at the same time, he was described as eating meat 3 times a week because, as he said, nobody wanted to live on mush. He told Americans to reduce their meat and fat consumption down to 30% or less. That extremely influential 1961 American Heart Association recommendation, what was the basis for that evidence? And at the time, there really was only one big study to support that recommendation, and that was coincidentally by Ansel Keys. It was called the 7-Country Study. It was conducted in 7 countries, mainly in Europe, but also the US and Japan. It was on nearly 13,000 men only. And what they did is they went out to these countries and they measured the men's diets, and then they followed them over time. It's called an observation or epidemiological study, to see who then succumbed to to any disease and death. And then they tried to correlate the disease or death outcomes to something in their lifestyle. The way they ate or their cholesterol levels was something else that they measured. This was an extremely influential study. If you read 10,000 nutrition papers, as I have, they will all telescope back to this 7 countries study. It's always cited. It's like the big bang of modern nutrition studies. And so I spent an inordinate amount of time analyzing this study because of its extreme importance. And I found a number of extremely disturbing things. First, I should say what the results were. The results of the study, they found what they had expected to find, which is that the men who did not eat much saturated fats seemed to have had lower rates of cardiovascular death. So they had, in Crete, for example, on the island of Crete, where they ate only 8% of their calories were taken as saturated fats, they died much less at much lower rates than the Finnish lumberjacks who ate 22% of their calories as saturated fats. So there seemed to be the correlation that Ansel Keys had been looking for. But so as I said, this is the study where I went and tracked down everything that I possibly could, even in foreign language journals, and found all kinds of everything I could find about it. And there's really a number of critiques that can be made about this study that I and others have made about this study. One thing that can fairly be said is that Ansel Keys cherry-picked the countries that he chose. In the same way that he cherry-picked those countries on that previous graph that you saw and had been sort of slapped on the wrist for that by Yerushamy and Hilbo, he rather than sort of take that criticism to heart, he then repeated it. And he chose countries where he knew that they weren't eating much saturated fat, because this was in the late 1950s in Europe, and there had been countries had been devastated by World War II. Those countries were Italy, Greece, Yugoslavia, and so their food supply had also been devastated. So 4 million Italians had emigrated from Italy, and 150,000 Greeks had left their countries, and their food supplies and food routes had been devastated. But he knew that they ate very little saturated fats and that they had low rates of heart disease. He avoided countries like Switzerland, Germany, France, where he knew from previous explorations that they ate a lot of saturated fat, actually, and they also had low rates of post-World War II heart disease, but he did not go to those countries. I actually asked his closest colleague, right-hand man Henry Blackburn, why did you not go to those countries? Their official explanation that they've given is that they went to the countries where they had enthusiastic help, and that was the way that they chose them, which is not criteria that you would call scientific particularly. But when I asked Henry Blackburn that, and he said, well, we didn't go to Switzerland and France because Keys just had a personal aversion to being in those countries. So, science has this process of this idea of randomization, trying to select things in a random way in order to avoid bias. And it's fair to say, and the opposite of that is called cherry picking. So I think it's fair to say that the countries in the 7-country study were cherry picked. It's also true that there were problems in the results of the 7-country studies, that the results did not hold up within countries. So for instance, the Eastern Finns died of heart disease at rates more than 3 times higher than the Western Finns, even though their lifestyles and their diets were virtually identical. And the islanders of Corfu ate even less saturated fat than did the countrymen in Crete, yet on Corfu, the rates of heart disease were actually higher. So there were all kinds of inconsistencies in the data that Keys could not resolve. It was also true that even in the populations that he found that had lower rates of cardiovascular mortality seemingly from eating less saturated fat, there was no difference at all in total mortality. That is to say, maybe they died less often of a heart attack, but then they died more often of something else. And so their mortality equaled out, total mortality equaled out in the end. And then another problem is that if you look at the number of people for whom they actually looked at the dietary data, that is to sample what they ate and try to measure what they ate, it turns out that they only looked at the dietary data of 500 men out of a total of 12,970 men, which is less than 4%, which is not a statistically significant sample to be able to say that that's representative of your larger population. So I just have one other example, which is really more emblematic of the problems, but I use it because it's so extraordinary, which is that on the island of Crete, where he went, and these were sort of his star pupils. These are actually his star subjects. These are the people. They seemed to be very long-lived, very healthy. They had a pre-industrial way of life. Their way of life charmed Ansel Keys and his fellow researchers, and these are actually, he studied there, the men he studied there became the foundation for the Mediterranean diet that we all know today. All of that data telescopes back to this study that he did there. But he went there during 3 different weeks on different periods to sample their dietary data. He took dietary data from only 30 or 33 of them. But during one of those weeks, he went by mistake during Lent, when they were all conscientiously avoiding meat and dairy and eggs and cheese. So this meant that he seriously undercounted the amount of saturated fat that those islanders were eating. The Greek Orthodox Lent is a strict one. One study on Crete discovered that saturated fat consumption actually halved during Lent, and that study was done in 2001 when they were certainly probably less religiously observant. And Keys does mention this problem in his study publication, but he just dismisses it, and he says, as he does other inconvenient problems that he comes across, saying, well, we just don't think it was an issue.
Now, Ms. Teicholz, do you know whether Mr. Keys, Ansel Keys, was a doctor?
He was not a medical doctor, no. I just want to add something here about, because I'm often asked this, if not saturated fat, then causing heart disease, what else did Ansel Keys find? And so I want to just follow up a little bit that in 1999, one of Ansel Keys's his fellow project leaders, Alessandro Menotti, who headed up the Italian part of the study, he went back and he looked at all the data again, and he discovered actually that what better correlated with heart disease was not saturated fat, but sweets, which was defined as sugar and pastries. And he found that the highest correlation was with sweets and heart disease. And I asked him actually, well, so why did you not discuss in the study team about the possibility of sugar causing heart disease? Because all these populations were not eating very much, like the islanders of Crete, in addition to not eating much animal foods, potentially, were not eating much sugar. And Alessandro Menotti said, he said, we did not discuss it much he said, sugar was never discussed properly among us 7 country study leaders. We didn't know how to treat it. We reported the facts and had some difficulty explaining our findings. And I spoke to another of the 7 country study leaders, Don Kromhout, and he said Keys was very opposed to the sugar idea. And I write about this in my book, how Keys was very alert to the idea that the hypothesis that sugar causes heart disease was a competing hypothesis to his own, and that only one could be right, or he felt only one could be right. And so he actually took great pains to try to shoot down the professors who were promoting the idea of sugar as being causative in heart disease. And one of those particularly was a Imperial College professor in London called Yudkin. He was the most well-known proponent of the sugar hypothesis. And Keyes, in a 9-page critique in atherosclerosis, says Yudkin and his commercial backers are not deterred by the facts. They continue to sing the same discredited tune. And he calls Yudkin's idea that sugar causes heart disease to be a mountain of nonsense, which was a feature of Keyes's response to challenges to his ideas that we will explore a little bit later as well. But I mean, essentially, sort of rather than dealing with the arguments of just slandering somebody's character and trying to and insulting them, say that they're motivated by financial reasons, or just saying that they're wrong.
So, Ms. Teicholz, would you be able to tell Madam Chair whether any efforts or studies were carried out to actually test the diet heart hypothesis?
Yes, thank you. Yes, of course there were randomized controlled clinical trials, okay? So everybody in the 1960s recognized that the 7-country study, even though it was big and large and seemingly persuasive, it was still only an observational study. So one of the elemental rules in science is an observational study can show association but not causation. And so to show causation, you need to do a clinical trial, preferably a randomized controlled clinical trial. That's sort of the gold standard. And so there was a tremendous effort by governments all over the world to undertake randomized controlled clinical trials on the diet heart hypothesis. And these are what Dr. Harcombe reviewed yesterday, that in the 1960s and 70s, there was a massive effort to undertake these kinds of trials. And let's see. I don't think I'm going to go through all of these in great detail because Dr. Harcombe, I think, did a good job of reviewing them. But just briefly, there was one in Oslo on 412 men for 5 years. Then there was the Finnish mental health study that lasted for 12 years. My list is a little bit different than Dr. Harcombe's list, just there's different reason for inclusion and exclusion. But, I mean, there's the London trial on soybean oil, the Sydney diet heart trial. There was, and these are all the NIH-funded ones. The NIH alone spent billions of dollars trying to prove Ansel Keys' hypothesis. The LA Veterans Study, the Minnesota Coronary Survey, the Mr. Fit trial, as it's called, and later the Women's Health Initiative. And one thing that's important to say about these trials is, often people say, well, we really don't know what dietary advice to give because there's really just so hard to do clinical trials, and we don't really have, we just don't know what to make of the evidence. I want to say something about these trials, that they're remarkably special. This is when governments were ambitious about the possibility of doing nutrition studies. They did them in inpatient settings. Most of them are done in mental hospitals or VA hospitals or settings where you can no longer do this kind of study because it's considered unethical today to feed people in an inpatient setting like that. So they were highly controlled, meaning that they got all their meals. They could control all their meals. It's so different than many dietary trials that are done today when people are just given a book and said, maybe an hour of counseling a week and are said, good luck to you. We'll try to help you keep up with this diet. These are inpatient clinical trials. They also, all of them, or almost all of them, had hard endpoints, meaning that they were able to follow people long enough to look at indisputable outcomes. That means death. You cannot dispute death. Heart attacks is also considered a hard endpoint, a little more disputable, and there's some more variation in diagnosis about a heart attack. Compared to trials that we do nowadays that are short-term, and we measure things like blood lipids, HDL, LDL, triglycerides, there's a lot of debate around whether or not those accurately predict your heart attack risk. So these trials are special because they followed people up until they had a hard outcome.